I pulled into my cabin driveway after 3 months of hell at work, desperate for peace. Instead, I found strangers living in my house, smoke coming from my chimney, and the HOA president screaming that I was trespassing on my own property. That's when I knew my quiet weekend was ruined. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into what should have been my peaceful retreat. Instead, I found myself staring at a scene that made my blood boil instantly. There, parked brazenly in my spot, sat a beat-up Honda Civic with bumper stickers proclaiming live, laugh, love, and wine o'clock somewhere. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was seeing her, Margaret Whitfield, the self-appointed queen of our mountain cabin HO, standing on my front porch like she owned the place, her arms crossed and her face twisted into that familiar expression of righteous indignation that had terrorized homeowners in Pine Ridge Estates for the past 5 years. "You can't be here," she shrieked the moment I stepped out of my truck, her voice cutting through the mountain air like a rusty chainsaw. "I called the police. You're trespassing." I felt my hands shake as I reached for my keys, the metal cold against my palm. After 3 months of hellish overtime at the construction site, dealing with impossible deadlines and a boss who treated his workers like dirt, I had been counting down the days until I could escape to my cabin. This place, these 4 walls and 20 acres of pine-scented sanctuary, represented everything I had worked for since my divorce 2 years ago. It was supposed to be mine. "Margaret, what the hell are you talking about?" I called back, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "This is my cabin. I own this place." But even as I said it, I could see something was terribly wrong. The windows that should have been dark were glowing with warm lamplight. Smoke was curling from the chimney I hadn't used in months. And through the front window I caught a glimpse of someone moving around inside. Someone who definitely wasn't supposed to be there. Not anymore. Margaret's voice hit a pitch that probably had the local wildlife scrambling for cover. The HOA voted. "You've been in violation of the occupancy requirements for over 90 days. The board has the right to reassign usage rights to members in good standing." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "What are you talking about? What occupancy requirements?" Margaret pulled out a folder thick with papers, waving it like a weapon. Section 15.3 of the updated covenants, which were mailed to all homeowners 6 months ago. Properties must be occupied for a minimum of 30 days per quarter, or ownership reverts to HOA discretion pending a board review. I stared at her, my mouth dry as sawdust. 6 months ago, I had been drowning in medical bills from my father's final battle with cancer, working double shifts just to keep my head above water. I barely had time to sleep, let alone check my mail or attend HOA meetings about rule changes that sounded like legal gibberish. I never got any notice about. "Ignorance of the rules isn't an excuse," Margaret interrupted, her eyes gleaming with the kind of satisfaction that made me want to put my fist through something. "Besides, Brenda needs a place to stay while she gets back on her feet after her divorce. She's been staying here for 2 weeks now, and she's already done more for this property than you have in months." Brenda. I should have known. Margaret's best friend from their weekly wine club, a woman I'd met exactly once at a neighborhood barbecue where she'd spent the entire time complaining about her useless husband and eyeing everyone else's property like she was pricing it for auction. The front door opened, and speak of the devil, there was Brenda herself. She looked different than I remembered. Thinner, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. But she had clearly made herself at home. She was wearing what looked like my old flannel shirt over her jeans, and I could smell something cooking on my stove. "Oh," she said, blinking at me like she was surprised to see me. "You must be David. Margaret told me you might show up." "This is my house," I said, and I hated how my voice cracked on the words. "You need to leave. Now." Brenda looked genuinely confused, glancing between me and Margaret like she was watching a tennis match. "But Margaret said the HOA gave me permission to stay here. I've been paying rent and everything." Rent. The word hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just stealing my sanctuary, they were profiting from it. "How much?" I asked. "What? How much rent have you been paying?" Brenda shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Margaret said since it was temporary and since I'm helping with maintenance and upkeep, just $400 a month. $400. For my cabin that I was still making mortgage payments on. For the place I had scraped and saved to buy as my refuge from a world that seemed determined to grind me into dust." Something inside me snapped. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Both of you. Get out of my house right now. You can't make us leave." Margaret stepped forward, her face flushed red with anger. I have documentation. I have legal authority as HOA president. And I have a deed and a mortgage. I shot back, pulling out my phone. Want to see who the police think has more legal authority? That's when Margaret smiled, the kind of cold, calculating smile that should have warned me she was already 3 steps ahead. Actually, she said, I already called them. They should be here any minute. As if on cue, I heard the distant wail of sirens echoing through the valley. My stomach dropped into my boots. Of course she had called first. Margaret never went into battle without stacking the deck in her favor. I had maybe 2 minutes before the cops arrived, and I needed to figure out how to explain this insane situation to officers who would undoubtedly side with the well-dressed suburban woman over the guy in work boots who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Brenda, I said, turning to her with what I hoped was a reasonable tone, you seem like a decent person. You're being used here. Margaret is charging you rent for property she doesn't own, while I'm still paying the mortgage. That's fraud. For a moment, Brenda's face flickered with uncertainty. She looked at Margaret, then back at me. Is that true? Don't listen to him, Margaret snapped. He's just angry because he got caught violating HOA regulations. The board voted unanimously. What board? I demanded. Who else was at this meeting? Margaret's silence was answer enough. There hadn't been a meeting. There hadn't been a vote. This was Margaret's personal power trip, enabled by her ability to manipulate the system and take advantage of people who were too busy or too trusting to fight back. The police cars pulled into my driveway, 2 of them which seemed like overkill for a property dispute. I watched as 2 officers got out, both of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else than mediating between neighbors on a Tuesday evening. Evening, folks, the older officer said, his hand resting casually on his belt. We got a call about a trespassing complaint? Officer, thank goodness you're here. Margaret immediately launched into her performance, her voice taking on that trembling, vulnerable quality she used whenever she wanted to play the victim. This man is trying to force his way into a property that the HOA has temporarily reassigned due to his violations of our community covenants. The officer looked at me with the weary expression of someone who had dealt with too many neighborhood disputes. Sir, do you have documentation showing you own this property? I pulled out my wallet and handed him my driver's license, along with my mortgage payment booklet and the deed I kept in my truck's glove compartment, a habit left over from my construction days when having proof of legitimate business was sometimes the difference between getting paid and getting stiffed. This is my cabin, I said as calmly as I could manage. I bought it 2 years ago. I've been working overtime for the past 3 months to afford a vacation, and I came home to find someone else living in my house. The officer examined my paperwork while his partner started asking Margaret for her documentation. I watched her confidence falter slightly as she realized that her folder full of made-up HOA regulations wasn't going to carry the same weight as an actual deed. Ma'am, do you have any legal documentation showing that you have the authority to reassign property ownership? It's not reassignment, Margaret insisted, but her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. It's temporary usage rights based on violation of occupancy requirements. And you have a court order for this? Silence. The younger officer was already walking toward Brenda, who had been standing in the doorway looking increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Miss, what's your relationship to this property? Margaret told me I could stay here temporarily. She said the HOA had given permission. Did you sign a lease? Not exactly. She said it was more of an informal arrangement. I saw the officers exchange a look. They'd clearly dealt with situations like this before, HOA busybodies overstepping their authority and innocent people getting caught in the middle. Here's what's going to happen, the older officer said, his voice taking on the no-nonsense tone of someone who was done playing games. Sir, this is your property according to the documentation. Ma'am, he looked at Margaret, unless you can produce a court order or other legal documentation giving you the authority to remove someone from their own property, you need to step back. But the HOA rules are a civil matter, the officer interrupted. If you believe there's been a violation of your community covenants, you need to handle that through proper legal channels. You can't just move someone into another person's house. Margaret's face went through several shades of red before settling on a color that reminded me of an overripe tomato. This isn't over, she hissed at me. The board will hear about this. What board? I called after her as she stomped toward her car. The imaginary one that exists only in your head? The officer stayed until Margaret drove away, making sure she understood that any further harassment would result in actual charges being filed. Brenda, to her credit, seemed genuinely embarrassed about the situation. I'm so sorry, she said as she gathered up what looked like several weeks' worth of belongings. I really didn't know. Margaret told me you had abandoned the place, and that the HOA was just trying to prevent it from becoming a problem property. It's not your fault, I said, and I meant it. Margaret has a talent for making herself sound official when she wants something. I feel terrible about this. Let me give you the money I paid her. It's not much, but... Keep it, I told her. You're going to need it more than I do. But Brenda? Next time someone offers you a too-good-to-be-true housing arrangement, maybe get it in writing from someone other than a self-appointed neighborhood dictator. She actually smiled at that. Lesson learned. After Brenda left and the police cars disappeared down the mountain road, I finally walked into my cabin. It felt strange, like coming home to a place that had been lived in by strangers. Brenda had clearly tried to take care of the place. The floors were clean, the dishes were washed, and she'd even managed to get the temperamental wood stove working better than I ever had. But it wasn't the same. Someone else's books were on my shelves. Someone else's food was in my refrigerator. Someone else had been sleeping in my bed, sitting in my chair, looking out my windows at the view I had bought and paid for. I sank into my favorite armchair, the one piece of furniture that felt authentically mine, and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had almost happened. Margaret had come within a hair's breadth of successfully stealing my home, and the scariest part was how easily she had almost gotten away with it. If I hadn't decided to come up a day early, if Brenda hadn't been obviously uncomfortable with the situation, if the police officers hadn't been reasonable people who actually looked at the documentation, I could have lost everything. My phone rang, startling me out of my dark thoughts. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. David? This is Tom Morrison. I live about 5 cabins down from you. I vaguely remembered Tom, a retired teacher who seemed nice enough during the few neighborhood interactions we'd had. Hey Tom. What's up? I heard about what happened tonight. Word travels fast up here. He paused. Look, I wanted you to know that Margaret never called any kind of board meeting about your property. In fact, most of us had no idea she was even claiming HOA authority for something like that. Relief flooded through me. So there really wasn't a vote? Hell no. And David? A bunch of us have been talking and we're pretty fed up with Margaret's power trips. She's been pulling similar stunts with other people. Nothing this extreme, but threatening fines for trivial violations, making up rules that don't exist, generally making everyone miserable. What can we do about it? Well, that's what I'm calling about. We're organizing a real HOA meeting, with actual homeowners instead of just Margaret and her wine club. We want to vote her out as president and establish some actual oversight so this kind of thing can't happen again. For the first time in hours, I felt something that wasn't anger or exhaustion. It was hope. Count me in, I said. When and where? Saturday afternoon at the community center. 2 o'clock. And David? Bring that documentation you showed the police tonight. We want to make sure everyone understands exactly what Margaret tried to pull. After I hung up, I walked out onto my deck and looked out at the view that had sold me on this place. Miles of forest stretching toward distant peaks, all of it bathed in moonlight that turned everything silver and magical. This was why I had worked so hard, why I had sacrificed so much. Not just for the house but for the peace it represented. Margaret had tried to take that away from me, but she had failed. More than that, her overreach had finally pushed the other homeowners past their breaking point. Sometimes the worst villains defeat themselves by going too far. I opened a beer from my own refrigerator, sat in my own chair, and for the first time in months, I felt truly at home. Saturday's meeting was going to be very interesting.